Hi guys, in today's video we're going to talk about the etymology of percussion instrument names, or essentially why we call things what we call them and where those names came from. And it's sometimes interesting, it's sometimes really obvious and boring, but it's good to know why we call it what we call it, or what it actually means that we're saying. And so we'll do common drum set pieces, we'll do some classical percussion items, and we'll just see what these names have to do with anything. So of course, if we just start with the word drum, that comes from the Low German Trommel, which in German today it's still called a Trommel, and this just means drum, and they think it's the sound effect, trom, 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 that a drum makes. Now, related to this sort of in concept, but a totally different origin, is timpani, which comes from the Latin tympanum, which just means drum, which comes from the Greek tympanon, which means drum, which comes from an older Greek word tuptein, which means to strike or to hit. So a thing that you hit is a drum. That's what timpani are. This is exactly the same origin as the word timbali, which we know as like the Latin percussion drum. But in some countries, they call timbales and timpani the same thing. It's a synonymous term. So it depends on who you're talking to what drum it is, but it does just mean a drum. Now, if we go specific to the snare drum, the word snare comes from the Middle Low German snara, which just means harp string, which back in the day, harp strings were made out of gut or like intestine, and also back in the day, snare drum snares were made out of the same thing. So it's the drum with the strings on the bottom. Makes sense. If we look at toms, the real formal term for them is tom-tom, and this is a Hindi word, tom-tom, meaning drum, or it's the sound effect that drums make again. So tom-tom, 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 right? Same thing as trom, but in Hindi. So this probably hints at some sort of ancient Proto-Indo-European root for drums being a sound effect starting with the letter T, because trom from German and tom-tom from Hindi being that similar, probably not a coincidence. Now, if we go to the word cymbal, that actually comes from the French cymbala, which comes from the Latin cymbalum, which comes from the Greek kumbalo, which comes from an older Greek origin, again, kumbe, which means cup, which is interesting because older drummers often used to call the bell of the cymbal's cup. So when you say the cymbal's cup, you're saying the cup's cup. It's really redundant, but at least it kind of makes sense. We're still viewing a cymbal as having a cup-like shape. This is also exactly the same origin for the word chime, which, is again from the Greek for cup, which means if you have a cup chime, you just have a cup. Again, super redundant, but hey, that's what percussionists are like. So what we call a glockenspiel here in America is the same thing in German, the Glockenspiel, and that just means play the bells. And the Glockenspiel actually literally used to be made out of bells, and we made it into flat bars just because it's easier at some point. But for that matter, the word bell just means bell. It comes from Old Dutch for bell, which probably means it has some Proto-Germanic origin, which is still bell. It's just what we've always called it. If we go along with the other like melodic percussion instruments, marimba is a Kimbundu word from Africa, or like Angola, meaning marimba. It's just the name of the instrument. As far as we know, always has been. Vibraphone's an interesting one. Comes from a combination of the Italian vibrato, or vibrate, and the Greek phone, which means voice or sound. So it's the vibrating sound. And of course, because it has the motor in it and it has that sort of tremolo effect, makes sense, kind of. The word for gong comes from the Malay gung, which means gong. It's just the sound effect, again, the sound that a gong makes, gong. And finally, if we talk about castanets, that comes from the Latin castanea, which is chestnuts, and they do kind of look like nutshells. And they may have, in fact, been nutshells at some point in the past. Now, those are the ones with interesting foreign origins. There's a whole bunch of ones that just have a stupid American English origin, but we're going to say them anyway. Like the bass drum is the drum that has a bassier tone. It's lower. We also call it the kick drum because you play it with your foot. Ooh. The hi-hat was originally called the sock cymbal, and it was super low to the ground, kind of by your foot. So, again, like kick drum, it just has to do with your foot wearing a sock. Now, at some point, it got a little taller, and they called it a low boy, and then we made it a little taller, and then we call it a hi-hat, because I guess hat is on the opposite end of your body from a sock. So it's all wardrobe related. The China cymbal is actually because that style with the extra bend in the edge is a Chinese version of a cymbal. So it's not some kind of weird racist thing. It's just that Chinese typically had one more bend in their cymbal than the Turkish did. And all the other cymbals that we know, crashes, splashes, rides, are the Turkish style of cymbal. So we're just specifying this is the Chinese version rather than the Turkish version. Now a stick, that's English for a piece of wood. A triangle, that's English for a three-sided thing, right? And the cowbell was a bell worn by a cow. So there's some that we really call super obviously. Sometimes you just got to call something what it is. But in a lot of these, you can hear there's a common thread that it's a sound effect or having to do with striking something. They're very obvious, and we've just used a word that was less obvious to us because it comes from a foreign source. So they really do have pretty straightforward naming conventions in most cases. Now, that's all the ones that I had for today. If you have any questions, let me know. If you have any interesting percussion words that you know about that I didn't include here, go ahead and comment them. But that's it. Take it easy. See you guys next time.